Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome, welcome. We're delighted so many friends could join us. We were afraid of the snow and everything, and then if himself here might be able to get in or not with the snow. But thank God, here we are, in spite of or because of the snow. And my name is Thomas Groom. I have the privilege of currently serving as the director for the Church in the 21st Century Center. I've also been a long-suffering professor of theology and religious education here for about 40 years. In fact, I'm in my 40th year. I began just after I made my first Holy Communion, and maybe it was my confirmation, but I've been here ever since. And I'm very proud to be part of the great work of the Church in the 21st Century Center. Many of you undergraduates who are with us will know C21 from our Agape Latte program that is so magnificent and so successful here on campus. Others may know us from our publications, our two most recent issues of the Resources magazine, and we mail about 200,000 of these twice a year. And the previous one was on conscience at work, with himself, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, doing what he does so well. On a Saturday when he goes down to hear confessions, he goes to confession first himself. And somebody told me that it only takes about 3 or 4 minutes. And an undergrad said, how could he do it? I said, well, if you go every week, it'll only take about 3 or 4 minutes. If you go once a year, it'll take a half hour. But it's a 3-minute confession. So I can well imagine the Pope doesn't have many temptations. And if he goes every week, it only takes a few minutes. And then this issue is really a spectacular issue on forming conscience, and is particularly geared toward our youth and young adult as they nurture their conscience. And it's in light of that our conscience theme for this year that we've invited so many distinguished speakers to reflect with us on that, and in a kind of a general way. So that's why we invited Father Rollheiser to be with us this evening, and along the general theme of conscience and so on, and conscience formation. But if you don't have copies of these magazines, there are some left outside, pick them up on your way out. And if you'd like to receive them regularly, just sign up, and we're more than happy to mail them to you free of charge. So it's part of Boston College's commitment to the life of the Church in the world. To introduce Ron, let me do it very briefly, because he needs no introduction. I know that's a kind of a cliche phrase, but in fact, I think he's been one of the most significant voices on the contemporary spirituality, digging deep into the resources and the layers and layers of tradition, the rich tradition we have as Catholic Christians, and yet articulating that in a way that has appealed to the human heart in just a magnificent way. I stumbled upon his book, Holy Longing, years and years ago, and literally was transformed by it and tremendously enriched by it, and I've gone back to it many, many times since then. And he's one of the finest voices we have. He's been writing a column since 1983, and it appears in over 90 newspapers throughout the English-speaking world, and also being translated into other languages as well. And I read him every week, and I just can't. I'm always amazed at what he comes up with, like how creative and imaginative and engaging it invariably is. And I keep thinking this week it won't be that good, but sure enough, it's as good as ever. Every week the fellow comes up with it. So he's just a tremendous, rich resource for all of us as we to nurture our spiritual lives and our faith in the world. He's a big, long list of achievements and all the rest of it. Of course, he's a Catholic priest. He's an oblate of Mary Immaculate. And I say that with a bit of pride because I actually went to an OMI school, a boarding school in Dublin years ago. And when we first met, that was a particular connection we had, that I was an old boy of the OMIs, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, currently president of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas. Of course, he has his PhD in STD from the University of Louvain in Belgium. He's over 20 books, over more than 20 published books. As I said, 35 years writing this weekly column. Received many awards, distinctions. The other book that I love of his, apart from The Holy Longing, is The Restless Heart. And in a sense, that has been his theme all over the years. How do we feed the hungers of the human heart? And what are the spiritual resources, and especially out of our Catholic Christian tradition, that are so effective in responding to the hungers of the heart. So without further ado, would you please welcome Father Ron Rolheiser.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you. First question, how's the sound? Everybody can hear at the back? At least those who want to hear? Okay, I want to thank Tom Groom for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be back here. I've taught here 3 different summers. Was never paid well for it, but that's another question. Okay. And our theme tonight, it's conscience. But the approach I'm going to take tonight is not so much, examining your conscience, but how, maybe the subtitle could be, how do you form a developed conscience? Actually, Tom and I argued long about the title of this talk and so on, and he would never let me use my title, so I used it for a subtitle called Carrying Your Solitude at a High Level. I want to begin with, almost as a gathering hymn, 2 quotes that kind of set the stage. The first one is from Daniel Berrigan. Incidentally, we're just celebrating 1 year of his death. He says, "We cannot love others if we don't love ourselves, just as we cannot honor ourselves if we dishonor others." You get that line? That's my talk. Okay. And then Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer, and one of my assistants did this picture. I'm not sure that's him, but anyway, okay. I hope it's him, but that doesn't look much like him. But anyway, the quote is him. He says, "There's 3 kinds of souls and 3 prayers. The first soul, first prayer. I am a bow in your hands, Lord. Draw me, lest I rot. Second prayer. Do not overdraw me, Lord. I shall break. Last quote. Overdraw me, Lord, and who cares if I break?" In fact, if you know how Kazantzakis wrote his books, he wrote the book Zorba the Greek and so on, but he was a very, very intense man. And every time he'd write a book, he'd work himself to the very edges of a nervous breakdown. So for instance, when he wrote The Last Temptation of Christ, which incidentally is a great book. I'm not sure it's a great movie, it's a great book. But he went to Palestine and he walked all the roads there for 3 years. He went to the desert for 40 days and he tried to do everything Jesus did. And he worked himself to the very edge of a nervous breakdown. Then he sequestered himself in a hotel room in Jerusalem for 6 weeks and wrote this book. And afterwards he was completely burned out. It took him a year to recover. So he was an intense man. So that last line, he says, "Overdraw me, Lord, and who cares if I break?" Okay. I want to give you a couple of stories just to, and then I want to, whatever time we have left, I want to talk about commandments for the long haul, to carry our solitude at a high level, to love ourselves properly, to love others. We have to first love ourselves, and we can't honor others if we don't honor ourselves. A couple of stories for flavor. There's a Czechoslovakian writer. Now, I haven't read him for some years, but back in the early 90s, there's a young Czech writer called Ivan Klima. Okay? And he wrote a book. He was still in his 20s. It's a book from a young person, and it was a very interesting book. It was called My First Loves, Ivan Klima. And in there, he came of age in Czechoslovakia just in 1968. And when Czechoslovakia was exploding, both with the Russians moving in, but also those were years when Czechoslovakia was exploding with poets and authors and all kinds of wonderful things were happening intellectually there. And that's when, writers like Kundera and stuff came. And he wrote this book, and he was a Marxist, left Marxism, and was an atheist. And he had all these atheistic friends and so on, and many of them were living kind of a bohemian kind of lifestyle, which young Klima could never do, and he couldn't figure out why not. Since he didn't believe in God, he said, why don't I give myself over to just this bohemian lifestyle? And he could never do it. And his friends always said, you're too uptight, and you have Christian morals even though you're not a Christian, and so on. And his whole book is, the essays are a struggle about his own kind of, uptightness inside of himself. And he ends the book with this line. He said, I'm in my late 20s. He said, I've never even given myself over to life the way my friends did. He said, if I died today, and if there was a God, said, if I died today and there was a God, he said, would God look at me and say, Ivan, why didn't you live your life? Or would God say to me, Ivan, it's wonderful that you carried your solitude at a high level. That's where I get the expression from. So it's wonderful that you carried your solitude at a high level. I don't know. There was a young man who was perplexed. Second story. Some years ago when I was still living in Edmonton, I was doing spiritual direction. There was a young man, Steve was his name, and he came to me. He was a very, very mature young man. And again, mid-20s, and he was discerning. He was making a very big decision in his life. And he was discerning between getting married or going to the seminary. And he said, I think I want to be a priest. He said, but this is what's holding me back. He said, he has a remarkable story. He said, when I was 15 years old, and I just learned how to drive, he said, I lived on a farm, and we were about 20 miles out of the city. And he said, one night, and my dad was young. He said, I was the oldest in the family. My dad was still young. He was in his early 50s. And one night, just before dinner, he had a heart attack, a severe heart attack. And he said, we were living in the country. There was no thing of calling an ambulance. He said, we had to bundle my father into the car and drive him to the hospital. He said, and I was the oldest son, so I was driving, 15 years old, without a driver's license. My mother was in the back seat holding my father. He said, and on the way to the hospital, he died. And he said, as sad as that was, he said, as an adult now, he says, there was something beautiful about it. He said, my father died in the arms of my mother. And I always thought, that's the way I want to die. He said, that's the way a person should die. He said, if I become a priest, that's not the way I'm going to die. He said, I'll die in some infirmary and them chanting some Latin hymns and so on. He said, so that puts me off. He said, but on the other hand, he said, I'm really taken by people like Daniel Berrigan and Dorothy Day and some of these people. He said, what they're doing, just the way they give themselves over to life. He said, and they're not dying in anybody's arms. That Jesus died on a cross. He said, so I'm torn between that. Now notice in both stories, both is the dilemma. He's carrying his solitude at a high level. Notice the idealism in both cases, whether he should get married, whether he should become a priest, and so on. He's carrying his solitude at a high level. So I give these stories more for flavor. Now, how do we do this? Okay, I'm not going to tell you how many commandments I have because I'm watching the clock, but there may be 10, there may only be 5 or 6. Okay, I'll put the important ones first. Loving ourselves healthily, commandments for the long haul. And so the first one is this. You want to love yourself properly, carry your solitude at a high level, be grounded in something beyond your culture and this world. Beware the crowd. That comes from Jesus. You know, it's interesting when you read the Gospels. You can read all 4 Gospels. And Scripture scholars tell you that in the Gospels, every time the word crowd is used, you could supply the adjective mindless. You know, it's always pejorative. Crowds in Scripture are pejorative. They do crucifixions, they do stupid things, they try to, stone a woman to death for adultery and so on. Crowds are mindless. Crowds crucified Christ, because crowds are caught in hysteria. They're caught in ideology. They're caught in all kinds of religious fevers and so on, none of which are healthy. So it's so important for us to be men and women of true noble hearts, who are big. We have to ground ourselves in something beyond our culture and beyond our world. Since I quoted Daniel Berrigan, I'll tell you a little story about Daniel Berrigan. This happened late on in life. And he spent the last years of his active life working in a hospice for dying people in New York City. And at one stage, he was invited to give a talk at the University of Notre Dame. And very famous talk. I'm not sure he got a stipend for it, but this is his talk, okay? And a sister introduced him, with a huge, flowery kind of introduction, all the things this man has done. When Berrigan went to the podium, he talked for less than 2 minutes. And this was his talk. He said, I'm working in a hospice for dying people. He said, and I need that. He said, I need it more than the dying need me. He said, because it grounds me. He said, when I'm working with people who have no more stake in this world, he said, it grounds me in another world. It grounds me in he said, it takes away all the superficialities of life. It grounds you beyond ideology and so on. And he said, that's why I do this. But they had an interesting little twist. He says, the topic I was given to speak on, and they had given the topic, where is God speaking in the world today? And he said, I like that topic because I can actually answer that. He said, right now I'm working in this hospice. He said, right now we have a young man, Tommy. Tommy's in his 20s and he's dying of cancer. And he's in the late stages of it. He said, right now he is completely gone to this world. He's lying in bed with tubes. He said, we don't know whether what he hears, he can't speak. And he said, every day I spend at least an hour just sitting with him, holding his hand, he said, and struggling to hear what he's saying to me. I'm trying to get what he's saying to me because he can't speak. He said, because that's the only place where God is speaking in our world. And he walked off the stage. Not sure he got paid. It was a powerful talk. He said, I sit with a dying patient and I struggle to hear what he's saying to me because he can't speak, because that's where God is speaking in our world. I leave that with you. So important. We need to be grounded. You know, our culture, in some sense, and I hope you won't be offended by this strong image, in many ways, Western culture right now, secular culture, is the most powerful narcotic that's ever been created on this planet, for good and for bad. I mean, there's many good things. It's wonderful. We're all enjoying the benefits of it. But it's so powerful that in many ways, if we're not reflective, it just swallows us whole. You know, that it's a powerful, powerful narcotic. And incidentally, that's why our extreme Islamic brothers and sisters are so much against it. They say we got to protect our kids from that. If our kids are exposed to that, they're gone. You know, we need to be grounded. It's interesting when you read the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is the Gospel of prayer. You know, Luke has Jesus praying a lot. In fact, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus prays more than all the other Gospels put together, you know. And it's also in Luke's Gospel where they asked Jesus to teach them how to pray. In every other Gospel, Jesus has to volunteer the lesson. Sit down, I want to teach you how to pray. In Luke's Gospel, they come and say, Lord, teach us to pray. And because they see something, in Luke's Gospel, they see that Jesus is grounded in something. See, he's able to forgive enemies. He's able to turn the other cheek. He's able to be serene in the face of crisis in the way we're not. And they realize he's drawing this from some other place. He's drawing this from some other source. And they realize it's coming from his prayer. That he's grounded in something beyond this world, and at a certain point they want it. The disciples said, I want this. I want this deep grounding. I want to be sourced that I can forgive enemies, that I can have this kind of heart as Christ has. So that's the first commandment, too. To ground ourselves beyond the culture of our world, and that has to be done partly deliberately. Work with the poor, do something, have a contemplative practice or something that just pulls us, that we can relativize our culture. Secondly, be free of ideology. Easily said, not easily done. I quote here Jim Wallace, who I think is as close as we have a person today as Dorothy Day. I think we have Jim Wallace in Washington. And Wallace says, don't go to the left and don't go to the right, but go deeper. You know, today, again, like I said, in the Gospels, the word crowd is always pejorative. And today, in our society, Western society, and not just the United States, but Western society, basically almost all over the world, we are breathing in ideologies that's almost impossible to free ourselves from. You know, today, we use the word sincerity. So some said, be sincere. I'm not sure we could even define anymore what that means, you know. So to give you an example, you know, just because we're breathing in ideology of the left and the right, turn on talk radio here in the United States and turn to any station you want. And you're going to get the right demonizing the left demonizing the right, somebody demonizing Trump demonizing somebody else, and so on. We breathe this, at a certain point, how do we really know what we think? You know, remember this was like 10, 15 years ago. Remember when Mel Gibson came out with that movie called The Passion of Christ? And it was so controversial. So the right were saying, that's the best thing ever done on Jesus, and the left were saying it's a terrible thing, and so on. I was kind of convinced nobody actually watched the movie. We watched each other watch the movie and reacted. You know, we're just caught in ideology, and it's just so hard to. It's the air we breathe. You know, they say we don't know what's sincere. A few years ago, one of my nephews, he was finishing college, and during the last semester, he ran out of money. Okay, so he didn't want to take another student loan. So there was a lot of family in the city, so he just took a week crashing on my sister's sofa, then somebody else's sofa, and he just was kind of working his way through. And kind of a lackadaisical guy and so on. And so one Sunday we were out for brunch, and one of my other sisters said to him, his name was Dale, she said, Dale, if you really get desperate, you can come and live at my house. And he said, how would I know if I'm desperate? Okay. He was living desperation. See, how do we know if we're sincere? You know, so oftentimes we really said, what do I really think about this? What do I really believe here? And so on. See, we're so caught up in ideology, and invariably ideology of the right, the left, we demonize, and so on. That's not noble. That's not carrying our solitude. That's getting caught in the crowd. That's hysteria, and so on. You know, it's interesting. I often ask students this. Was Jesus a liberal or a conservative? I'll ask you that. It's impossible to answer. Jesus was a person of deep compassion, and he went wherever that compassion took him. They took him to the right, and took him to the left, and they took different places. So it's also, you don't want to be in the middle either. Some say, well, you know, I'm going to be in the middle. That can be another ideological position. And that can be a very wishy-washy position. So, like what Jim Wallace says, don't go right, don't go left, just go deeper. Okay, that's where Jesus went. Become a person of compassion. Then thirdly, make hope your horizon. Okay, have a meta-narrative. Okay. You know, I don't think we understand hope very often, because we tend to confuse hope with two things which it's not. We tend to confuse hope with wishful thinking. Now, wishful thinking isn't hope. So if you say, I wish I could win a lottery, that's not hope. You know, you can't hope to win a lottery. You can only wish it. Okay? It's based on nothing. Okay? Now, or we oftentimes confuse hope with optimism. Where someone says, we often ask, are you optimistic? Are you optimistic in today's climate? Are you optimistic since Trump became president? Are you optimistic, you know, in the church today and so on? That's completely unimportant. You know, optimism is also not hope. Someone says, you know, I always see the bright side of things. You might not have any hope at all. Okay? What is hope? I want to give you a line from Teilhard de Chardin, or a story. And then we're going to get to Jean-Olivier Tremblay, you know. But Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a man of hope. And actually, people who knew him, he wasn't a very upbeat man. He was kind of a sober man and a somber man. But he had this great vision. If you read Teilhard de Chardin, he has this wonderful vision of how God's kingdom is actually going to happen and how the world's eventually going to get together and so on. And one day he was presenting this vision to a scientific community. And one of the people challenged him. They said, you know, he was a priest. They said, Father Pierre, they said, you know, you have this wonderful optimistic schema, but suppose we blow up the world with an atomic bomb. What happens then? And Teilhard says, well, that would be a 2 million year setback. Okay. He said, that would simply be a 2 million year setback. He said, but it's going to happen. He said, not because I say it's going to happen. He said, it's going to happen. Why? Because Christ promised it, and in the resurrection, God showed that God has power to deliver on a promise. When God brought a dead body out of the grave, God can deliver on a promise, and Christ promised it. See, hope is based on the promise of Christ and the power of God. And that makes for a very different kind of vision. You know, I want to quote first Archbishop Tutu. You know, And our oblates tell this story. They were quite involved with him, and Dennis Hurley was one of our oblates involved with, as they were dismantling apartheid in South Africa. And the oblate said sometimes when Tutu was preaching, and if you've ever seen him on television, he's just wonderful, and he's a figure of hope, figure of joy. And so they said he'd be preaching, and soldiers would try to intimidate him. So as he's beginning his homily, soldiers would walk down either aisle with submachine guns. They said, Tutu would smile at them and say, "I'm glad you came to join the winning side." He said, "We've already won." Okay, and he was right. They laughed at him. He said, "We have already won." You know, when we sing Easter hymns and, you know, the strife was over, the battle's won. We're not just talking about Jesus, it's won. The end of our story is already written. We just have to live in the face of the fact that we believe it. Now, the guy I want to quote, these pictures, there's a young oblate from Quebec City, Pierre-Olivier Tremblay. A couple years ago, we had a symposium at our school, and we were reflecting on just missiology today and the struggle and why people aren't going to church and so on. And he gave a stunning talk. At the time, he was chaplain at Laval University, and he's a young man. And he said, I'm chaplain at the University of Laval. He says, and I'm working with these young people, and he says, they're wonderful. He said, their energy, their life, and so on. He says, I'm just inspired by their energy, their life, their vitality. He says, but none of them has any hope. He said, they are living without hope because they don't have a meta-narrative. See, he said, hope is based on a meta-narrative. He said, so they have all this vitality and all this youth and wonder and energy. He said, but their happiness and stuff depends on what's happening. Are you breaking up with your boyfriend? How are your marks? Are your parents breaking up? Are you well? See, these are all things that said they don't have a big story. There's no meta-narrative, And see, so heartbreak can break you, sickness can break you, loss of a friendship can make you suicidal, and so on, because there isn't any big story. I'm old enough to remember another time when I was a kid, same time as Tom, we were all raised on these catechisms. The catechisms were very simple, and we had to memorize them as kids. The first question was, who made you? We'd say, God made you. They'd say, why did God make you? To know, love, and serve him in this life and to be happy with him in the next. And they tell you the story of Adam and Eve and the fall and apple and Jesus coming and so on and the resurrection. You have this big story. Okay, it was a meta-narrative. And it gave you permission. And it gave you, it gave you permission to have downsides. It gave you permission to have your heart broken. It gave you permission to have your parents die. It gave you permission for even you to die, because the end of your story is written, and it's a happy ending. The great mystic Julian of Norwich says, in the end, all will be well, and all will be well, and every manner of being will be well. But notice, in the end, in the middle, it might not be that at all, But see, I love the way Tremblay put that. He says, these are wonderful young people with great energy, he said, but they don't have hope. Some have optimism, some have wishful thinking, but they don't have a meta-narrative. So those of you who are young in this room, develop a meta-narrative so that you don't, the great theologian von Balthasar put that in different language. He said, if you don't have, if you're not living a theodrama, you're going to live an ego drama. See, a theo means God. We're either living a God drama, which is a big story, or we're living an ego drama, which is everything has to do with our heartbreak and stuff on a given day. Okay. Then, fourthly, have a wide Catholic heart. And there I quote Kazantzakis, even though I don't think that's a picture of him. I love this line. And it's in his autobiography. He says, the bosom of God is not a ghetto, but the human heart often is. The point I want to make here is this. The word Catholic, I'm not sure all of you are, I'm sure all of you are Catholic. You're not necessarily Roman Catholic. Because, the opposite of Catholic is not a Protestant. Protestants can also be Catholics, and Catholics might not be very Catholic. The word Catholic means universal, wide, wide, wide. The wider your heart, the more Catholic you are. See, the opposite of a Catholic is a fundamentalist. You know what a fundamentalist is? I'm going to give you Jesus' definition of Catholic. Jesus says in John's Gospel, in my Father's house there are many rooms. Okay? Now, he's not talking about geography in heaven. He's talking about the size of God's heart. See, in God's heart, there are lots of rooms. In a fundamentalist heart, there's one room. It might even be a good room, but it's one room. Okay, and that's fundamentalism. Now, the challenge here, and I really want to emphasize this point, and one of the reasons I picked this today is because so much in our culture, in our politics, in our church and stuff, is telling us to slim down your heart, without offending anybody. What does the expression America first say? That's not very Catholic. That's not very biblical. That's not very Christian. You know, everybody's first. See, it redefines how we understand our denominations, how we understand our citizenship, how we understand patriotism. You know, you're not, first of all, citizens of the United States. We're citizens of the world. You know, when we say God has specially blessed this nation, that's true. Except God has also especially blessed every other nation in the world. All the people are special, and every nation is blessed. One of the great privileges I've had as a missionary is to have lived in different countries and been to many countries and so on. And I haven't had a real home since I left home at 17 and so on. But to see that people all over are just as real as we are. They bleed the same blood. They have the same heartaches. They have the same loves. They're just as real as we are. We're citizens of the world. We have to have Catholic, wide hearts. You know, that's carrying solitude at a high level. And it doesn't mean you don't love your church. It doesn't mean you don't love your country, but you love every church. You love every country. It's not just true for patriotism. It's also true for our denominations. You know, every person who believes in God is your brother and your sister, not just Roman Catholics and not just Christians and so on. That's Christ's challenge. You know, in my Father's house there are many rooms. Okay, fifth, the practice of chastity as a form of nonviolence. The practice of chastity as a form of nonviolence. I want to begin with this line from Daniel Berrigan. You know, with Daniel Berrigan, people who knew him well, they oftentimes, these groups, they would have house Eucharist. So, you know, they'd be celebrating Eucharist and he'd be presiding and so on. And they say before he'd give out communion, Berrigan would say, now, before we receive communion, I want you to make a pledge. Make this pledge to yourself. He said, and pledge that when you eat the body of Christ, you're going to pledge yourself to never abuse the body of another person. Good line. That's what the Eucharist. When you eat the body of Christ, pledge yourself never to abuse the body of another person. So when you drink the blood of Christ, pledge yourself, they say, I will never spill innocent blood. I'm not going to spill anybody's blood. Okay. Now, I'm attaching that to chastity, and that's not a stretch. The practice of chastity is the ultimate practice of nonviolence. Okay. You know, let me just wonder here a little bit. You know, today chastity has a bad name. It's just, you know, so that chastity, you know, it's mostly, when you bring up the word chastity, you're going to get pitying looks, or you're going, you know, you poor thing, you know, or oftentimes it's an object of derision, you know, chastity for Jesus, and so, oh God, and people think so. You know, and sometimes those perceptions are brought on because it's been presented wrong, or people who are presenting chastity sometimes they don't have a rich concept of this at all. But chastity is, and I want to talk about this, is a very important concept, and it's a concept we desperately need, and not just to do with sex. First of all, chastity is much, much wider than sexuality. Let me lead into this. This book is probably older than many of you in the room, but back in 1987, Ellen Blum, who was a very famous educator, University of Chicago, He wrote a very famous book called The Closing of the American Mind. And it was a secular book on chastity. You know, Bloom wasn't a believer. He was a Neoplatonist. And he wrote one of the strongest books ever written on chastity. But he begins the book this way, you know, not an abstract concept. Bloom said, I was a very bright young student. He said, and I won a scholarship in psychology to Cornell University, Ivy League school. Okay. He said, and I walked into my first class at Cornell, and a world-famous professor, he said, started this class this way. He said, well, he said, you come here from your small towns, your little parochial backgrounds. He said, well, I'm going to bathe you in great truth, and I'm going to set you free. And Bloom said he wasn't bathing us in any great truth. He said he reminded me of a little boy when I was 7 years old who told me there was no Santa and no Easter bunny. But he wasn't bathing us in any great truth. Neither was the professor. He said, so after I got my grade from this professor, I went to see him and said, Professor, you know what? You know what you taught me? That I'm going to forever teach exactly the opposite the way you do. And he taught all these years at the University of Chicago, and he said, I always began my classes this way. I'd look at the young people and say, you know something? You're more sophisticated than I am. You're more sophisticated than I am. You've been everywhere. You've done everything. He said, so I'm going to try to teach you how to believe in Santa and the Easter Bunny, and maybe you'll have some chance of being happy again. He said, I'm going to try to teach you how to believe in Santa and the Easter Bunny, and maybe you have some chance of being happy again. And he said, now this is a secular speaking, not a priest or whatever, or the Pope or whatever. And he's saying, when I look at young people in America today, in America in general, he says, I will single out, he said, our lack of chastity is our biggest issue. And it's the greatest source of our unhappiness. You know, and he said, it's closing our mind. I'm going to define chastity in a few minutes, but listen to this story. He said, I'll give you just a story. He said, first symptom. He said, I'm a Platonist. He said, I love Plato. He said, you read Plato's dialogues, and Plato says, during their breaks, my students sit around and they tell wonderful stories about the meaning of their immortal longings. Bloom said, during their breaks, my students sit around and talk about being horny. He said, such is the difference between Plato and today. Notice, those are two, they're talking about the same feeling, they're talking about a very different language. He said, it's closing the nobility of our minds, bringing it down. Now, what does he mean by chastity? See, chastity, first of all, is not a sexual concept. You know, it covers all of life. Chastity is 3 words. You put 3 words together, you have it. It's the word respect, reverence, and patience. Respect, reverence, patience. That's chastity. It means to live in everything, not just in sexuality, in every area. Give you an example of lack of chastity. You know, imagine a 10-year-old kid, and it's Christmas time, and it's 2 days before Christmas, but he can't wait to see what his Christmas present is. So at night he gets up, he sneaks down, he tears it open, looks at it, and tapes it back up. That's a fault in chastity. See, what he's done, notice, he's ruined the gift. He's ruined the gift by not using the proper reverence, waiting, patience. You know, and we struggle in our culture. I'll give you a personal example. When I was a student in Belgium in 1981, and that was a time when there was still what we called the Iron Curtain, and it was hard to get into Russia. And, you know, Russia was this great feared Soviet Union and so on. But my dad was born there, so I wanted to go there. Okay, and I wanted to try to visit my dad's birthplace in Russia, and so on. So I was a student in Belgium, so we had a group. I joined a group with mostly American and Belgian tourists, and we went in there between Christmas and New Year's. And we were about 40 of us on a tour and so on. So we landed in Moscow, and there was a kind of a blizzard, but this was Russia in the old days, and we were locked in the airport for almost 40 hours. Nobody told us anything. We didn't have any Russian money, so we couldn't buy anything to eat and so on, and we're there. But the Russians were locked in there too. It wasn't just us. You know, they just closed everything down. Within about 2 or 3 hours, you could tell every Westerner from every Easterner in the airport. The Russians and the Eastern Europeans, they were sitting, drinking vodka on the floor, playing cards, smoking. No, it's no big deal at all. every American, including myself, we were running to phones, we were phoning embassies, we were saying, we're kidnapped here, get us out of here, we can't put up with this bullshit and all this and so on. Okay. They were chased, we weren't. See, for us, we don't know how to wait. We simply can't wait. We can't wait for anything. It's no accident. There's a powerful pressure in us. So when you were a little kid, we mean well, and so the kid gets to Disneyland at age 3, at age 4, he's got every computer and gadget and this and that, and they're dating at age 11. And when you're 16 or 17, you say, Mommy, I'm bored. So we never waited. We never waited for anything. So chastity is this rich concept, but especially I love Berrigan. Berrigan says it's also the ultimate form of nonviolence. And, next time you go to communion, say, I received the body of Christ. I want to vow, if I'm eating the body of Christ, to never abuse a human body. When I drink the blood of Christ, I'm going to vow to never somehow draw innocent blood someplace. That's what the Eucharist means. Okay. Now, number 6. And I have my eye on the clock here. Okay. Be idealistic. Never call second best by anything other than what it is second best. Okay. One of the great mentors in my life has been Doris Lessing, the British author who just died. I've read all of her books. Very, very powerful writer and so on. One of the original feminists who wrote and so on. But Doris Lessing says, be idealistic and never call second best anything other than what is it's second best. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay. I'll tell you a story. Okay. Some years ago, when I was still living in Edmonton, and I was working with young people getting ready for marriage. So I'd help do the marriage course, I'd never go down every third Monday, and there would be anywhere from 10 to 25 or 30 couples there preparing for marriage. Young people, sitting there, wonderfully in love, holding hands. And at one stage, it always comes up, because most of them were already living together, and so on. The question would come up if they'd ask about living together and so on, and today it's almost the norm rather than the exception, and so on. And so we're saying, like, ideally, this is not what, and I presented some reasons for it. Now, one of the young men there, he got it, he says, Father, he says, I actually agree with you. He said, in my heart of hearts, I would prefer that we didn't do this. He said, but he said, today, he said, look at society. He said, my God, you'd have to be 1 in 1,000 to do that. So I said to him this, the young woman you're sitting beside, you going to marry her? I said, yeah. He said, if she'll have me. Okay. I said, what kind of marriage do you want? Do you want one like everybody else's, or do you want 1 in 1,000? See, idealism works if you want to be exceptional, if you want to be 1 in 100, if you want to have something that's really special, we have to pay the cost of it, which is to be 1 in 100. It's interesting, and young people, and some of you in the room, young people can still teach us, because when we get older, we get pretty jaded, and we're no longer idealistic. And one of the great strengths of John Paul was that John Paul knew how to appeal to the idealism of young people. Remember John Paul was saying, don't sell yourself short. Always, go for the best and so on. And I'm saying this too, don't sell yourself short. And so let me tell you a story on this in chastity. Some years ago when I was living in Toronto, and the Toronto Globe and Mail is the liberal newspaper in Canada. We have the Post. We have 2 national papers in Canada. The Post is the conservative paper. The Globe and Mail is the liberal paper. But anyway, there was a Jewish columnist, been writing there for years, very bright woman, Jewish, kind of Jewish agnostic. But she was reviewing a book that was written by one of these young evangelical Christians, which was called Chastity for Jesus, And so she was reviewing this book. So she said, I read this book. I said, because I need to review it. She says, and I was prepared to be cynical. She said, even before I read it, just the title made me want to be cynical. She said, but I read it. She said, but I was quite taken by it. She said, this was written by a very idealistic young woman, Said, you know, I have 2 teenage daughters. Says, I want to have my daughters read it. I want to have my daughters read it. Said, there's some powerful idealism there. She said, I think it'll do them some good. But she said, it's one thing if you're a young person and you have all these dreams and ideals to look forward to. So it's quite another thing, she said, if you're 45 and you have nothing to look forward to. She said, it's good for my daughters. They're still idealistic. For me, I'm beyond that. Just like I'm already invested in something beyond idealism. Those of you who are young in this room, invest in idealism. Great little story I heard from my philosophical mentor in England, Eric Maskell, who was one of the people who was at Oxford when C.S. Lewis was there, you know, Charles Williams, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, they're all friends. And he said, but one of their friends was and he later became a Benedictine monk. He had actually been an Anglican, then became a Benedictine monk, and he later became quite a famous liturgist. Those of you who study liturgy will recognize his name, Dom Gregory Dix, okay? But he said, first of all, Dix got expelled from Oxford for a prank that he pulled off. That when he was a graduate student, and he thought that Freud was all a hoax. And so he was one of the student leaders. So he wrote a talk of all psychological cliches, and he hired a professional actor to deliver that, and he advertised him as Freud's nephew, you know. And he said, and all these professors came, they're supposed to be a joke, but it went over really well. He said, and they all bought in on this, so it turned out a joke. And then when they found it was a hoax, he got expelled from Oxford. But he was a very idealistic young man. And famous clip, he was in BBC television one day, debating with a bishop, okay? And so they were debating about young people, where society's going. And so Dix gave this wonderful idealistic version. When he was finished, the bishop said, well, now that we've heard the idealistic ravings of a young man, maybe we can talk about reality. So Dix said, you know, Your Excellency, he says, those are the ravings of an idealistic young man, but they aren't mine. He said, you can read about them in John's Gospel, chapter 17. Jesus was an idealistic, raving young man. We need idealism. Okay. Then, dream with others. Effective compassion is collective. And I give you a quote from Edward Skilomex. A famous quote, and we've shamelessly used that in a lot of our documents and so on, because it's so good. It captures so much in one line. Skilomex says, what we dream alone remains a dream. What we dream with others can become a reality. Take that up. What you dream alone remains a dream. What you dream with others can become a reality. Story. You know, Henry Nouwen, this was when he was still at Yale. He decided that he was going to explore with some people, with some Christians in community, what does it mean to be compassionate? What does the word compassion mean? And actually, somebody else from this group wrote the book, Compassion. Okay. So there was a group of small Christian community, and they met every week during Lent. And they would pray about and talk about what does it mean to be compassionate. And after Lent, they wrote the book, and they said this. They said, compassion, true compassion is collective. Charity is individual. Compassion is collective. And this is the image they used. Nouwen says, you know, when you watch the news at night, you know, you watch the 5:30 news, a lot of times you simply get depressed because you have all these problems, not just here, but in the world, and there's poor, and there's starving, there's earthquakes, and this and that, and we can't get along with each other, and so on. And you shut off your TV, you're depressed. What can you do? And you feel so helpless. You feel this powerful helplessness, like, what can you and I or one person do in the face of all the world's problems? He said, well, you can, you know, light your one little candle like the Christophers. He says, no. What you do is you begin to unite with other people. He said, you know why you feel helpless when you watch the news? Because you're watching it alone. Now, if a parish community watched the news together, I'm talking metaphorically, they could do a lot more than one person. If the Archdiocese of Boston watched the news together, they couldn't solve the world's problems, but they could do a lot more than any one parish. if the Church of the United States watched the news together, they couldn't solve the world's problems, but they could do quite a bit. If all the churches in the world watched the news together, they could solve the world's problems. And you know something? The world's problems won't be solved till all the churches in the world watch the news together. You want to do something? Connect. Connect with people. Connect with others, and so on. What we dream alone remains a dream. What we dream with others can become a reality. Then, live for others and always be on the side of the poor. Jesus says, first of all, live for others. The one who seeks to save his or her life will lose it, and the one who loses his or her life saves it. Jim Wallace says this, and I think we can't repeat this line too often, especially today. Jim Wallace says, any gospel that isn't good news for the poor is not the gospel of Jesus. And any Christian proclamation that isn't good news for the poor is not a proclamation from Jesus. Because, remember Jesus, the very first words out of his mouth, I've come to bring good news to the poor. Okay? And our Christianity, our idealism, our service to the world, and also our own happiness is tied with somehow being connected to the poor. That we can't love ourselves properly if we do not love and serve the poor. And we're going to be happy, and this isn't just a truism, we're going to be happy to the extent that we're giving ourselves over to those who somehow have less than we have. The happiest people in the world that I've known and are always people who are serving others, who are just simply giving their life away, and vice versa. I think sometimes we don't make a distinction between joy and pleasure. We can have a lot of pleasure, but not serving others. That's not joy. That's not real happiness. You can have a lot of pleasure in your life and not be happy at all. And you can be dying and have deep meaning and so on. I often say to people, if someone comes up to you with this and they say, are you happy in your life? Like I've asked you, are you happy? Are you happy in your vocation? Are you happy going to Boston College? Are you happy in your relationships? Is that a good question? No. It's a question to torture yourself with. As soon as you start thinking pretty soon, well, maybe I'm not that happy, you get tears in your eyes, because it's the wrong question. Imagine somebody came to Jesus on the cross and said, are you happy up there? He said, no. And today I'm particularly not happy. Okay? It's the wrong question. Someone comes to you and says, is there meaning in your life? Is there meaning in your teaching? Is there meaning in what you're studying? Is there meaning in what you're planning as a student and so on? That's a very different question. See, that tracks more to the question of happiness, true happiness. The way we define happiness goes up and down. On a given season, you're unhappy. Given season, we feel happy, and so on. But that's not true joy. And true joy comes just from serving others. I was at a civic banquet recently, and they were honoring some alderman or somebody who had actually done quite a bit of work, build houses for humanity and so on. But one of these civic guys, he had a little lingo. I want to give that to you. It's kind of neat. He says this. He says, here's an axiom. He said, if you want to be happy for an hour, take a nap. Okay. He said, you want to be happy for a day, go fishing or take a walk. Okay. If you want to be happy for a month, go on vacation. You want to be happy for a season, go on a honeymoon. And if you want to be happy for a lifetime, serve others. As trite as that is, there's some depth to that. Okay, the last two I'm going to just mention because we're going to leave some time for questions and so on. And that is, beware the demon called success. Beware the demon called success. You don't have, Mother Teresa always says, you don't have to be faithful, successful, you only have to be faithful. Now, since I gave you this, let me give you something a little earthier than Mother Teresa on this one. And then Tom will end on this. Some years ago when I was living in Toronto, I went down and they had Mordecai Richler, the Jewish author, was coming to speak, and to journalists and writers and so on. So I'll sit in on this. And he gave a very good talk to these young undergraduates and graduates. But he was very earthy. So Mother Teresa says, you don't have to be successful, only faithful. I'll tell you what Mordecai Richner said to these young people. He said, I encourage you, he said, work hard. Try to be a success. He said, just work hard, try to be a success. He said, but don't become an asshole afterwards. That's about as blunt as you can put it. And he says, you don't have to be an asshole to be a successful writer. He said, but everything's going to invite you in that direction. You know, that's just another way of stating what Mother Teresa just said. Okay, that's Mother Teresa on the street, you know. But that's just a great line, you know. And I've heard a lot of talks. Don't always remember him. That one I remember. He was just so blunt. He said, work hard. You want to be a success. You want to get published. You want to fulfill your ambition. But don't become an asshole when you do it. He said, stay close to family, stay close to church, stay close to things. And in fact, he says, people ask me, did you come here because you value young writers? He said, kind of. He said, but you know why I came here? He said, because I have family in Toronto, and it was a free trip. He said, you're the add-on. He said, but that's the point. He said, stay close to family. He said, my family has grounded me, he said, in the way nothing else would have ever grounded me. You know? So that's just another way of what Mother Teresa said. The last point is kind of obvious. Always keep a sense of humor to save yourself from pompousness and grandiosity. You know, laughter is always needed to deflate the pompousness of the king. You know, all power and all success eventually becomes pompous and grandiose, and we do that. Keep a sense of humor. That's the role of the court jester. You know, don't go there. Okay, I have just a number of quotes. We can have them up. You can look at them. I love this quote from Dag Hammarskjöld. He says, character and greatness are predicated on mirroring with purity the greatness of life. Incidentally, read Dag Hammarskjöld. They've published a lot of biographies on him. He was one of the great men of the last generation. And he tried to do in his life to mirror with purity the greatness of life. Okay, Robert Frost, and you can read the others. But anyway, Tom, this is the end of my shtick. You're going to come up here and... Okay.